Thank you. I had the good fortune of working with Anthony when he was in Toronto. So prior to this, I was a professor of medicine and computer science at the University of Western Ontario, 25 years doing clinical research and fellow of the Canadian Institute of Health Research. And one of the biggest challenges we had was actually finding patients for clinical trials. So that was sort of the impetus to start building global registries. Essentially, what this is about is bringing stakeholders together, patients, advocacy groups, clinicians and researchers, and working closely with pharma and biotech, particularly in rare disease, where it's very difficult to find the number of patients that you need to do clinical trials. So that's just a little bit of a background. And why is this so important, especially in rare and in rare tumors? The ability to find patients, the ability to find high-quality data that ultimately can be used for clinical trials has become a hot topic, particularly where you look at the guidance now from the EMA, FDA, and some of the other regulatory bodies. So I'll talk very briefly about that so that you kind of understand why this is being done. It's also giving patients access to information in trials. In many of the rare disease registries that we build, we actually do elicit feedback from patients, not only as patient-reported outcome measures, but really to look at the feasibility of some of the clinical trials so that the endpoints can be determined upfront and taken to the regulatory authorities so that we can start to design studies that hopefully are not going to fail. Anthony has shown you what we've done in the melanoma registry, which is now in 12 cancer centers. And multiple studies have come out of there, over 40 publications and papers that have been presented at both ASCO and ESMO. And really, what does that mean? It really means that for any of this to work, it's critical to have clear governance, data sharing agreements, and participation agreements. So anybody who participates in these global registries has to sign off on a data sharing agreement, which essentially means that you are governed by a scientific advisory board and a steering committee, because all too often I think we've seen that there are sites that will sometimes manage these registries, and it's really hard for the people contributing the data to the registries to gain access to the data. So this is a very transparent process. The registries are all GDPR compliant and HIPAA compliant. They're all placed around the world. With respect to Australia, we have been working here for several years. In fact, right now we're initiating a very large project for the Government of New South Wales and eHealth. And the Agency of Clinical Innovation, if you haven't seen it, the government are rolling out a large patient-reported outcome measurement solution, which goes live actually on our platform starting on July the 1st, and we're doing a lot of work in colorectal cancer. So certainly used to working around the world. I've just put this up here because this was a guidance document that came out by the FDA. Dr. Scott Gottlieb in December 2018 said, look, it's time to really look at real-world evidence that extends beyond what we're doing in clinical trials and really focuses on prospective observational longitudinal studies of high-quality data that ultimately you could use for secondary extensions of existing products, but also to use that historical cohort as a comparator arm as you're looking at fine-tuning some of the clinical trial design. So most importantly for innovative clinical trial design and adaptive trial design, for those of you who are familiar with some of the other cancers like breast cancer, there's a very large breast cancer initiative called iSpy and iSpy 2, which has 8 arms, but they have been able to compress the sample size. So I think it's a really interesting opportunity to start to look at how to improve our ability to hopefully bring new treatments to patients. When Anthony was talking about data mapping, there is a global standard for data mapping. It's known as AOMA. I won't go into the technical machinations, but essentially it's an umbrella which includes things like ICD-10 codes or 11 codes. It includes HL7, which is the standard that's used to pull data from electronic health records, and SNOMED and SNOMED CT. It's complicated. It's a whole team of medical informaticians who actually look at each data variable and map it to a standard that's ultimately going to be important for the regulators if these data are going to be used at any time for regulatory filings, which include safety. So for example, in Castleman's disease, which is a registry that's sitting on our platform, the EMA are currently using these data for safety, and that study has been going on for about 3 years now, where IL-6 is used in that condition. These are all global registries, and the way that we have built the platform is to have basically what we'll call a foundation, so that every other disease that you put on top of this can sit on the same foundation, and you're not just replicating things over and over again, building silos of different disease registries. You're leveraging the same landscape. So in simple terms, if you have a home, you want to lay the foundation first, and then you want to build different rooms. You don't want to build each room as its own home, because that's very expensive, and then being able to collect data in a way that's very facile is important. So I think Anthony's gone through some of the regulatory things, and this is really important because it has to meet a very high standard. Even if you're not using the data for regulators, ultimately when you're sharing data globally, you want it mapped in a way that ultimately you're going to be able to use. And the de-identification and pseudonymization protocols are also very important, because in this particular case, in the Ocular Melanoma Registry, it is global, and it will continue to grow, and the number of sites will continue to grow. So initially, I think Anthony wanted me to do a live demo of the system, but this is not the uveal one. This is melanoma. There is a full data dictionary, and the way the platform is built is that it's built to clinician workflow for the clinicians. The patients also have their own workflow, so there is a patient portal where patients can ultimately collect data. It's gesture-based, which means that with a click of a mouse, you can actually show where there's a tumor. If you're looking at it, if you see something topical, or even if here we will likely embed an eye so that you can actually show the margins. For the pathologist who was showing some of the work that she was doing, you can actually upload the image right into the platform. So it's really about having an end-to-end system where all of the data are there. All of the measurements that are required are embedded, and ultimately all the algorithms that will be used to compute any of the measures, whether it's TNM staging or status or any of the quality of life measures, all the algorithms are built right into the platform to make it very easy. Okay, so there's a significant amount of pathology. Again, this is not the one that is, because the uveal one has just gone for data mapping. I'm just showing you melanoma so you can see the level of detail that's going to be there, but also that it's a lot of drop-down menus, a lot of information that will be easy to enter, so that you're not manually entering text, because that's where you run into all kinds of problems, obviously. As new testing becomes available, we add it very quickly. So there is a data working group. They look at the new types of tests that are available, new treatments that are available, so that it's responsive and you're adding the information as it becomes available. Okay, I've talked about detailed staging, and it's not just for the current AJCC. You can go back. We embed several of the other AJCCs, because if you're looking at patients who come across multiple years, you want to be able to compare, and so all of that will be embedded inside. You'll be able to see different treatments that the patient has received, so that you'll be able to quickly see whether they've had progressive disease or a CR or whatever it is. Same thing with radiation. So again, for each of these fields, I know I'm going through very quickly, but it's to give you a feel and flavor for how much detail is going to be there. A lot of information on drugs also, and treatments, and an audit log, which is really a security log of every patient who's in the system, who's touched the system, because it's a permission-based system with high authentication of passwords, etc. But this is the fun part. So you collect all the data, then what do you do with it? And being able to actually use the data real time, there's some dashboards that are going to be embedded in the platform, so that if you just wanted to look at how many patients there are and where they are, everything is obviously de-identified. You can click on it, put it into a PowerPoint and use it. But for people like me who really just don't know how to write any code anymore, and I want to be able to look at how many patients and start to drag and drop, and I apologize that the resolution isn't great, but you can go through the registry, pick the variables you're interested in, and almost like a heat map, be able to see real time the variables that you're interested in. Box plots will also be available, as well as things like collinearity and correlations. Again, everything is built in R and it's validated. You're also able to download your own data and do your own analyses. And generalized plots such as survival curves, regressions, etc. will also be embedded. And this is just to kind of reiterate what Anthony said. When you're collecting these types of data, it's equally important to make sure that people have access and that they publish. And essentially, the melanoma registry and some of the other, we have 22 global registries. The key thing is that people are publishing, from residents to fellows to clinical folks, and patients get access to de-identified data that they can also use for policy and policymakers, so that when they're trying to get drugs funded, at least they have objective data that they can use. And obviously working very closely with some of the pharma and biotech, so that when they are planning their new studies, you have a registry in place with high quality data that can be utilized for that. Thank you so much.